I was scratching my head at first. I was like, okay, maybe that makes sense. Then I'm like, wow, okay, this is really a movie with a lot of twists and turns, and we're going to try to make sense of it. What's up, everybody? It is day one in the Charlie Adelson trial for conspiracy to put a hit out on Dan Markel. And opening statements started today and the first couple witnesses, and that's what we are going to break down and react to now, give you my thoughts. Some pretty shocking things I was not expecting from the defense's opening statement. A theory that they say the state has never heard, evidence that they say the state doesn't even have, and a theory of multiple crimes being committed that the state does not know about. So we're going to get to all that and more when we get to the defense's opening statements, but we're going to start, as every trial starts, with the state's opening statement. They have the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in all criminal cases, and they go first at trial. So that's where we're going to start. Let me know if you're watching this trial every day, and if you are, what site or where you're watching it from. If you're just catching clips or recaps, let me know that as well in the comments, because I like to know how people are piecing these trials together. I will be playing some clips throughout this recap and giving you my thoughts, and then I will check through the comments later, and we will eventually do some lives on this trial as well to answer your questions once you get them kind of stored up. I feel like it's good to watch the trial, learn about it, and then you guys come with some of the best questions that I've ever heard. It adds so much to the content. It makes the content interesting for everybody, because if you have the question, it's highly likely that somebody else watching this video has the same question. So hit that like button if you are watching this trial in any capacity. And let's get to the state's opening statement. They start out just by saying, as clear as day, Charlie Adelson hired the hitmen to do the job on Dan Markel. The defendant's girlfriend, Kate Magbanua, who we're going to hear a lot about throughout this trial, had connections through her, the father of her children, who was one of the hitmen. They talk a lot about Dan Markel, his family, his educational background, how he was a very respected law professor, and how the deed was done that day in a very gruesome and heinous nature. And we hear from the first witness, which the state recaps in their opening statement, or I should say lays the groundwork for, that he was a next door neighbor who heard a loud bang, saw a light colored Prius speed out of Dan Markel's driveway, waited a couple minutes. When he realized nothing was moving over there and Dan Markel hadn't left, he went over there to check on Dan Markel and found him in his car. He was still alive. He called 911. 911 came. He succumbed to his injuries a few hours later in the hospital. His sons were 3 and 4 at the time. And everything in their investigation led to the Adelsons, and very specifically Charlie Adelson, who is Dan Markel's brother-in-law, who is the defendant in this criminal case. They make clear, the state does, that Wendy Adelson, Dan Markel's ex-wife's mom and family, hated Dan Markel, and that the mom relied on Charlie Adelson to take care of her problems. They were very close. The divorce was very nasty, emotional, messy. And when they interviewed Wendy Adelson, she gave them a lot of information that would, in fact, point to Charlie Adelson as the person who set all this up, led the conspiracy, paid the money. And we'll hear some of what she says Charlie Adelson said. Now, it's going to be interesting because we got to wait and hear the defense's side as well, because they have explanations for a lot of this too. And they say in their opening statement that we're going to agree with a lot of the state's evidence and a lot of what the state says, but they just don't know the real context. I swear, the defense's opening statement was basically like a movie script. And I want to hear from you if you think it's going to work, or if it's too outlandish, or if there are some things that just don't logically fit, or if you think that's actually the more plausible explanation. And it's an interesting case because the defense kind of argues two things. It's a messy jigsaw puzzle that the state doesn't have all the connecting things that they need, but also that there's some other story that the facts point to. So it's almost like the defense is setting up a case that they've got to prove, even though they have no burden of proof. When you start to say all this other stuff happened, you start to create some burden in the jury's mind, even though constitutionally speaking and legally speaking, it doesn't exist. But let's hear what Wendy Adelson had to say about Charlie Adelson when law enforcement interviewed her.
Enforcement interviewed Wendy Adelson, and Wendy Adelson acknowledged that her family had a motive to kill Dan Markel, or to want him dead. She admitted that her brother, the defendant, had even said that he looked into hiring a hitman to kill Dan Markel as a divorce present to her, but he decided to buy her a TV instead because it was cheaper. And coincidentally, or not, That TV that this defendant bought his sister as a divorce gift instead of hiring a hitman would be Wendy Adelson's alibi for the morning of the murder when the victim was killed by a hitman.
As the TV, I think, was being delivered to her house or something. But there's a lot of jokes, and the defense says Charlie Adelson's just notorious for making bad jokes. It's like, yeah. And he tells that bad joke over and over again. And there's a lot of TVs used as code words. The defendant's going to adopt a lot of this and admit a lot of this and agree with what the state's saying about a lot of this, which is very strange. But maybe there was just too much of this evidence that they couldn't combat it. But we got to wait and see how they say it tells their story.
So this path of looking into Dan Markel's life to see who would have a motive to want him dead leads law enforcement to the Adelsons, including this defendant, a man who told his family that he'd looked into hiring a hitman to kill Dan Markel. The defense asked yesterday in jury selection, who's talked trash or heard somebody talk trash about an in-law, which is not a rare concept. A lot of people don't like their in-laws.
And that's a big part of this case. And I actually think that's a really skillful question in jury selection. So you get everybody out that thinks just because you say something or just because you hate somebody doesn't mean you're going to kill them, right? Everyday people, hate family members, hate in-laws. There's a million stereotypes and memes and jokes about it. There's there for a reason because it's true and it happens a lot. I love my in-laws, but just because somebody says something negative about their in-laws does not mean they want to kill them. And that's a very skillful voir dire question that the defense asked, probably to weed out a lot of people that had negative responses to that. But the state twisted around here.
But the difference here is that the defendant's comment stopped being just a little bit of trash talk when Dan Markel was actually killed by a hitman.
Yeah, it's not so funny when not only what you joke about comes true, but it comes true in the exact way that you said it came through. And you're going to admit now that it is your money exchanging hands, eventually getting to the hitman. Because he admits that. Yeah, it was his money. Yeah, it came from him. Again, I don't know what kind of guy continues to staple money and create these paper trails, which is part of the defense argument that, nobody would actually do that. It's like some people are dumb. We've talked about that before. Some people just are dumb. So if it's like, oh, they would never do that. It's like, well, some people would.
While the police are trying to investigate, who in Dan Markel's personal life may have a motive to kill him, they're simultaneously going down that second path I described to y'all, which was tracking down the vehicle that the neighbor saw fleeing the crime scene. When law enforcement retraced Dan Markel's steps the morning of the murder, they uncovered some chilling surveillance video of a Prius fitting the description of the one seen by the neighbor, following Dan Markel into the Premier Gym parking lot, waiting for an hour while he was inside, and then following him home from Premier Gym back to his neighborhood. They got these surveillance images from city buses, from Premier, from everywhere they possibly could.
And they connect that car to the triggermen, to Kate Magbanua, to Charlie Adelson. That's how they connect it all back. They also connect them with phones, surveillance cameras, text messages, contacts, that they were in the same place, same time. There's going to be a lot of evidence like that connecting all of these co-conspirators together. And they call the Adelson family non-indicted co-conspirators throughout. Seems like they would be able to be indicted, but at this point, they have not. And that's just kind of where we are. Let's listen a little bit more. And as I was listening to opening statements, the fact that they were saying follow the money trail in the state's opening, I thought that was a really good argument until later the defense is like, yeah, the money's from him. But let's take a listen here.
Those frequent contacts, and they actually share 2 kids in common. Responsible for following and killing Dan Markel. Luis Rivera, his nickname is Tato, and Sigfredo Garcia, his nickname is Tudo. But they continued to look for evidence of why 2 seemingly random men came all the way to Tallahassee to kill a man, Dan Markel, that they'd never met. What or who is the connection between these killers and the victim? Well, phone records reveal that one of Sigfredo Garcia's most frequent contacts was a woman named Catherine Magbanua. Her nickname is Katie. Garcia and Catherine Magbanua have a long history of an on-again, off-again relationship over the course of many years, and they actually share 2 kids in common. And lo and behold, when looking at the phone records, Catherine Magbanua is also one of the most frequent contacts of this defendant, Charlie Adelson. Law enforcement learned that at the time of Dan Markel's murder, this defendant was dating Catherine McBanois. She was his girlfriend at the time. So Dan Markel was a problem that this defendant needed to solve for his family. The defendant was looking to hire a hitman to kill Dan Markel. Dan Markel ends up being killed by a hitman. And who ended up being the hitman? It was someone with a close relationship to this defendant's girlfriend. The hitman was the father of his girlfriend's children.
Now, the state's opening also kind of sounds like a movie script, except it really all makes sense and sounds completely plausible. So the defense has to combat that. It's not like they're saying, I hired him because I went to FSU Law School and I didn't like him. So what's my connection to Sigfredo Garcia? I don't know Catherine McBanois. So it kind of falls apart. But when you have Adelson, and I did like him, I'm saying if there was a student, let's say, that didn't like Dan Markel and they want to try to pin it on them, well, you got to find a connection. Well, guess what? The Adelson family had motive. They didn't like Dan Markel because of what was going on with Wendy Adelson, and timing wise, they just lost this hearing and couldn't take the kids down to South Florida, et cetera, et cetera. Then this connection just falls into place through Katie. You can't make that stuff up.
So you can see how both leads in this case, followed by investigators, both of them charted paths to this defendant. Not only did looking into the motive lead law enforcement to the defendant because he wanted to hire someone to kill Dan Markel, but looking into the car, fleeing the scene, also led law enforcement to the defendant through his girlfriend at the time. So two different investigations arriving at the same conclusion. Law enforcement also tried to follow the money in this case.
Here we go.
And that was a third way that the evidence in this case points to this defendant. Law enforcement reviewed bank records, employment records, DHS-MV records of all of the suspects and saw that in the months after the homicide, Sigfredo Garcia, Luis Rivera, and Catherine McBanois all acquired some big ticket items. Rivera and Garcia both bought motorcycles and cars. Catherine McBanois got a breast augmentation surgery and later received a black Lexus sedan whose previous owner was Harvey Adelson. Catherine McBanois's bank records were analyzed, and there was no check ever written or matching cash withdrawal for the car or the breast augmentation, which was paid for in cash. Bank records also showed that Catherine McBanois's account had a huge spike in cash deposits right around the time of the murder. She deposited more money into her account in the 5 weeks following the murder than in the entire previous year before the murder. This was during a time when there was no record of her being employed anywhere.
Also, the three other people involved, getting a lot of cash, buying cars, motorcycles, augmentation surgeries, all in cash with the weeks following the hit. Again, coincidental? Just wait till you hear how the defense explains it.
Also, about 2 months after the murder, the defendant added Catherine McBanois to the payroll at the Adelson Institute. And she began receiving regular checks from their business account every 2 weeks for 2 years after the murder. And this was despite
So they put her on the payroll even though she wasn't working there.
The fact that she did not work at the Adelson Institute. So the money was talking. What were the suspects saying? That's what law enforcement wanted to know. So as they're examining the phone records in this case, they see a distinct pattern surrounding important events and dates in this case. The phone calls, and they can't see the content, they can't hear the content of these calls in these phone records, but they see that the calls are occurring. And the phone calls always went from Donna Adelson to the defendant, then from the defendant to Catherine McBanois, then from Catherine McBanois to Sigfredo Garcia, and back the other way. Kind of like train cars, they only touch the car right in front of them. Donna Adelson never calls Catherine McBanois or Sigfredo Garcia. Charlie Adelson never calls Sigfredo Garcia, or vice versa. So if this is a murder for hire, as law enforcement suspects, could it be that the defendant was wisely insulating himself from the actual shooters by having Catherine McBanois act as a middleman between them? Law enforcement decided.
Again, that timing is really important when you come back to what the defense is going to argue. And the defense is going to argue Adelson's innocent. He didn't do this. He was basically set up. So if he was set up, which we'll get to what they mean and how they explain it because it's wild later, coincidentally, his calls to Catherine McBanois came after he talked to his mom, which, they say he's always in the car. He's always on the phone. He calls his mom. He calls his girlfriend, who was Katie. Then Katie just happened to call Sigfredo Garcia. So Adelson gets called from his mom, then he decides to call his girlfriend, and his girlfriend decides to call the hitman. And how often, how many times did that sequence of events take place? That's what I want to know as well. And I think something the jury wants to know.
To launch an undercover investigation.
So now the law enforcement is going to launch an undercover sting to try and get more information. And she explains why, and it's pretty interesting.
Designed to clarify who the members of the conspiracy were and how information traveled within this conspiracy. So police applied for and received court authorization to listen in real time to the phone calls of the defendant and Catherine McManus. And this is what's known as a wiretap. By this point, the point that the law enforcement received authorization to do this wiretap, it was April of 2016. So it's been not quite, but almost 2 years since the murder of Dan Markel, which occurred in July of 2014. So by April of 2016, the defendant and Catherine McManus are no longer dating at that point. They've been broken up since the fall of 2014. Catherine McManus is actually back together with Sigfredo Garcia, the father of her children, at that point. The defendant has moved on to many other girlfriends since Catherine McManus. But the defendant and Catherine McManus are still in regular communication and have remained very close friends since the murder. And Rivera, who was the second hitman in that Prius, he, in April of 2016, was actually in federal prison doing time on another charge unrelated to this murder. So all of the members of this conspiracy have presumably gone on with their lives, believing they've gotten away with this murder. So even though law enforcement has authority to listen to their calls now, what reason would these people have to still be discussing the murder at this point?
So this is where it gets into if you have a problem with law enforcement and entrapment type deals and their ways of investigation, then that's understandable. But some of the responses people give when law enforcement ruffles some feathers, or what are they called? Shakes some people down or whatever, like happens in this case, you would expect if they had nothing to do with it, that they would just be like, what is he talking about? Instead, we'll hear what happens when law enforcement starts drumming things up again.
So police needed to stage an event that would generate conversation between the conspirators about the murder. And the plan was to send an undercover agent posing as somebody on behalf of Luis Rivera, who was incarcerated, to walk up to Donna Adelson on the street and try to extort money out of her. And law enforcement refers to this as the bump. So this undercover agent walks up to Donna Adelson one day. She's leaving the Adelson Institute during the day. The undercover agent hands Donna Adelson a piece of paper. And on the piece of paper is an article about the murder of Dan Markel with his picture on it and, FSU professor killed. Also on the piece of paper are a phone number and the amount of $5,000. The undercover agent tells Donna Adelson that he knows that the Adelsons are taking care of Katie, and he's there to extort money out of her on Rivera's behalf in order to even things out. The undercover agent never says the defendant's name or anything about the defendant's involvement to Donna Adelson. Then law enforcement listens to see.
They give just enough information, but not too much, so that when they go talking, it's very obvious that they know about the vague threat or conversations made by law enforcement by giving more information that law enforcement knows is true, but law enforcement did not tell in the initial contact with Donna Adelson, Charlie Adelson, and Wendy Adelson's mom, and the mother-in-law of Dan Markel, which was who the undercover agent initially bumped into and basically said, give me $5,000, I know what's going on, as if there's some blackmail going on. And again, the fact that law enforcement decided to take the blackmail route is what Charlie Adelson and his defense team end up using to try and prove their theory and their wild story that's coming up.
What will happen next? Will Donna Adelson go straight to the police to report this extortion attempt, or will something else entirely happen? As suspected, based on the previously observed communication pattern, the first person that Donna Adelson calls after the bump is the defendant, despite the fact that the undercover agent never mentioned the defendant to her. On that first call, one would think that Donna Adelson would say to her son, it's so crazy. Some man came up to me and he's handed me this article about Danny's murder, and he's seems like he's demanding money from us. She never says any of that. In fact, she never says Dan Markel's name at all. Instead, she tells the defendant that she needs to talk to him in person, not over the phone, about some paperwork that was hand-delivered to her. She said that this paperwork, she says this to the defendant, it involves the two of us, and that he should know what she's talking about. She says that he should bring cash to their meeting. And she also says that this TV is about $5,000. Donna Adelson tells the defendant that.
And again, $5,000 was the request. TV is what the state says is code word for hiring the hitmen because of Charlie Adelson's joke. It all falls together quite nicely, if I'm being honest, for the state. Now, the defense tries a very interesting theory that we're going to talk about, but as far as the state's evidence goes, it falls together quite nicely with vague jokes, text messages, and phone conversations and code words that, because of their undercover bump, really shows and falls in line as to why they connect somebody with a motive to hire a hitman, somebody that made jokes about it, put a code word on it, paid out money to all of the people involved, and then continued to basically think about paying out money to a fake blackmail attempt from law enforcement. Most jurors are probably tracking with the state at this point. We'll see what the evidence actually bears out, but the story is falling into place as far as a jigsaw puzzle goes, which is the defense's argument is jigsaw puzzle, every piece needs to fit or it's a mess. Seems like a lot of these pieces are falling into place. Let me know what you think in the comments.
The man who approached her mentioned an ex-girlfriend. Donna Adelson never says which ex-girlfriend she's referring to. She never says Catherine McManua or Katie's name to the defendant in that phone call. She only says that the blackmailer mentioned an ex-girlfriend. The defendant never asked his mom, whose ex-girlfriend? My ex-girlfriend? Which ex-girlfriend? He never asked that. Because as the evidence will show, he didn't need to.
Which is why it's important that he's had all these other ex-girlfriends, because, in 2 years, if the mom just said something about an ex-girlfriend, how would they know which ex-girlfriend he was even talking about?
He knew that this TV is about $5, meant that she was being blackmailed about Danny's murder for $5,000. And he knew that the ex-girlfriend in question was Catherine McManua. And we know that because after this call with his mother, the defendant calls Catherine McManua. He doesn't call his most recent ex-girlfriend. He doesn't even call the most recent ex-girlfriend before the most recent ex-girlfriend, the one before that. No, he calls Catherine McManua. And his call to Catherine McManua is the only call that he makes to any ex-girlfriend after getting the information from his mother that the blackmailer mentioned an ex-girlfriend. And he had not dated Catherine McManua for 1.5 years at that point. And although the defendant threatens to do it often, neither he nor his mom ever report the matter to the police. The only people that he discusses it with in these calls is Donna Adelson and Catherine McManua.
They go into some other recordings that they have about statements that they made explaining that if this was really police, it means they don't have enough to prove it, or they wouldn't be trying to get more. They'd be happy if it was the police. So nobody's trying to extort them. Now, again, these are all things the defense is going to kind of agree with, but say there are different reasons for this that the state doesn't know or understand. The state says he also comes up with a solution to potentially hire a hit on the blackmailer, and that he will continue to help Katie. She doesn't have to ask. And there are a lot of code words that are going to be used throughout this trial: listings, houses, TVs, things like that. Then the state gets into an interesting discussion about the co-conspirators, how they've already been convicted, how they had wiretaps and able to do all this stuff, and it got cleaned up for years. They talk about the cash stapled together and how it connects to the defendant. But they specifically talk about one of the trigger men that flipped and that told law enforcement what really happened. So let's listen to the state's explanation of that. 143. 428. 347.
That tenant may become a leash that never leaves you. Worried about a future tenant, actually worried that if he pays off the blackmailer, then the blackmailer may continue to come back again and again, or send a cousin or a friend to become a leech that never leaves him, that he can't get rid of. In another of these calls, the defendant tells Catherine McManua that someone who got in conspiracy. But one fact, though, is really clear throughout these calls is that all of these conspirators are hopeful that this blackmailer is law enforcement just trying to get information, because they think if it's law enforcement and the police don't have enough to bring charges, just fishing for information versus the other possibility, which would.
And by the way, the defense totally agrees. They wish it was law enforcement but for a different reason, which is, it's one of those things where the jury's going to have to figure out who's right and who's wrong. Not does the state have enough to prove this, but I want to hear from that other co-conspirator here.
Be inside information about their roles in Dan Markel's murder and may tell the police what they know. 2016. Luis Rivera, Sigfredo Garcia, and Catherine McManua are arrested. They're charged with the same charges before y'all in this trial. And Luis Rivera ended up cutting a deal with the state to tell law enforcement the truth about the murder of Dan Markel and the people responsible. Rivera told law enforcement that he was hired by Sigfredo Garcia to help kill Dan Markel. And Rivera described how Garcia told him that Catherine Magbanua, the mother of Garcia's children, secured this job for them. And the job was in Tallahassee, and it paid $100,000, with Rivera's being about a third of it, $35,000. Rivera explained that he and Garcia actually made 2 trips to Tallahassee with the intent of killing Dan Markel. The first one was a month before the murder. It was in June of 2014. And the second was when Dan Markel was actually killed in July of 2014. Rivera said that he bought a gun off the street for that second trip, and Garcia rented a car. For the June trip. Rivera bought a gun off the street, and Garcia rented the car for that trip. Garcia and Rivera did some scouting on that trip of Dan Markel's residence, some surveillance, but ultimately couldn't get the job done. They ended heading back to Miami. During the trip to Tallahassee, he said that Garcia had a piece of paper with a picture of the man that they were supposed to kill on it, and some handwritten notes as well. Cell phone records corroborated Rivera's information about the June trip. Rivera also told a story about an incident in Tallahassee where he and Garcia were riding down the road in the rented Prius, and Garcia accidentally discharged the murder weapon, and the bullet struck the floorboard of the Prius. Law enforcement tracked down that actual Prius again and were able to see evidence in the undercarriage that corroborated Rivera's information about the accidental discharge. So they're looking at the phone evidence, they're trying to find whatever they can to kind of corroborate what he's telling them. I mentioned earlier that both.
So they get one of the triggermen to flip, who tells the story exactly how the state believes it. Now, my guess is they're going to have some things on cross that make him seem like the not the most trustworthy or credible person. I'm just going to guess somebody that would get involved with this. Potentially there's going to be some impeachment material, but there are some corroborating things to the story that he told with cell phone records and the bullet hole in the bottom of the car from the accidental discharge, that it's going to be pretty interesting that if all that lines up, then maybe he is telling the truth.
Men, Garcia and Rivera, cut their phones off from the time that they left Premier and kept them off until well after the murder when they're on their way back home. Rivera said that the first call that either of them made after the homicide was from Garcia to Magbanua, where Garcia told her that the job was done. And Magbanua assured them that they would get their money the next day, which they did. Rivera says when Catherine Magbanua brought cash to him at his home. And all this information that Luis Rivera provided them was corroborated by, including when the money was dropped off, was corroborated by cell phone records in this case. Well, Luis Rivera told police that the next day after the murder, he was paid in cash by Catherine Magbanua, and that the money was packaged in a very unusual way. The money was in stacks of $100 bills, and the money was stapled together.
And they have evidence that that's how Charlie Adelson had his cash and paid people. And again, surprising to me, the defense is not even going to disagree that all this money did, in fact, come from Charlie Adelson. One of the other defense's arguments is they had all this evidence back in 2016, I believe, when they arrested and convicted all the other co-conspirators. So why didn't they just arrest and charge Charlie Adelson at that time? And the state finishes up basically their opening statement, which combats part of the defense's opening statement. Again, the state's all happens first, but I'm just trying to mix it so you understand kind of arguments of both sides as we're going. And they say we were able to clean up a lot of those wiretaps, get testimony like this, and now we're ready for Charlie Adelson, which to me means that Wendy Adelson and her parents are not necessarily completely off the hook. I don't know if they've made some deals or things like that, but not necessarily fully off the hook at this point. Okay. Hit that like button because we're about to get into the defense's opening statement. And to me, I was scratching my head. At first, I was like, okay, maybe that makes sense. Then I'm like, wow, okay, this is really a movie with a lot of twists and turns. And we're going to try to make sense of it as we discuss it now. And just jumping into some of the explanation of the beginning of the defense's opening statement. The defense starts out, unsurprisingly, by acknowledging the fact that this is an absolute tragedy. Dan Markel was a brilliant legal mind, father, son, brother. Charlie had nothing to do with it. He's innocent, but he wasn't friends with Dan Markel, but he didn't necessarily hate Dan Markel. That the whole defense team has great respect for the prosecutors and law enforcement officers. They go through the people that have already been convicted in the co-conspiracy. They talk about how the Adelson family is unindicted co-conspirators, but they get into this jigsaw analogy that the state had to make guesses in this case. They had all the evidence way back when, never arrested Charlie Adelson, but now they are jumping to conclusions. They are trying to fit puzzle pieces in that don't fit. And like I said before, When you make a jigsaw puzzle, every piece has to fit together, is the defense's theory. And when the pieces don't fit, it is an absolute mess. And that's what we have in this case, basically, is an absolute mess. Now, let's listen to the defense attorney set up what he calls a cliffhanger because he loves cliffhangers. And we'll get to what that cliffhanger is a little later. I've already kind of teased it, but we'll get to what it is here shortly.
Pieces together under their theories that they told you about today. I'm going to show you how those puzzles, those pieces, they didn't fit. They don't fit. And why? Respectfully, the state does not know what happened on July 18, 2014. On that day, 2 crimes occurred. The first one, the state knows about, and that was the brutal, heinous murder of Professor Markell. The other one, they don't know about. They're about to find out like you, because that day would forever change Charlie Adelson's life.
And spoiler alert, I will tell you what that second crime was as we continue to break it down through this opening statement, and we're going to see the evidence come out through cross-examination and probably defense witnesses. The second crime was extortion and blackmail by Garcia and Rivera, the 2 triggermen, and Katie Magbanua, who was the ex-girlfriend of Charlie Adelson and the connection with the shooters. And they basically, the defense is going to point the finger at them and write this Hollywood script that Katie heard that Dan Markell and his family made $1 million offer. Sorry, not Dan Markell. Charlie Adelson and his family made $1 million offer to Dan Markell to get the kids to South Florida, and Charlie Adelson could pay a big portion of it in cash. And as soon as Katie Magbanua heard that, the plan was put into place. Her and the father of her children and one of his friends, that they were going to commit this crime and extort the Adelsons out of that $1 million, since they knew they had it and they wanted that money. And therefore, they committed the crime knowing Adelson would be a target, knowing he had motive, knowing he had money, knowing he'd do whatever he could to protect his family and keep them out of prison and keep them out of harm's way. And therefore, that's what happened in this case. Those other co-conspirators that have already been convicted, that the state had better evidence for and convicted years ago and knew actually took part in it, those are the real bad guys, not Charlie Adelson. It just looks really bad for him because they set him up all along the way. And we'll go through some of the details and how the defense plans to use some of the state's evidence or just the undisputed evidence in this case in their favor. But generally speaking, that's the cliffhanger the defense is setting up that they end up hammering home at the end of this opening statement. He talks about Charlie's background, business family, super successful, dentist, likes to date a lot of women, likes, that he and Katie dated and it was informal, things like that. Wendy and he were not that close. He wasn't that close to his sisters, but later on she confided in him about the marital problems. Charlie had nothing to do with the divorce or had no, didn't take any decision-making power over the divorce or anything like that. But he has to address certain things. And while they say that Charlie Adelson, had nothing to do with it and he was blackmailed, they have to admit some of the horrible jokes that turned into a reality from Charlie Adelson. So let's listen to how they explain away some of those bad facts.
Charlie has a really bad history of telling bad jokes. So when Wendy left the house, his mom told him that she didn't have a TV. He asked her, he said, what can I do to help Wendy? She's moved to a new place. She's left most of the stuff behind. What can I do to help? And his mom said, she doesn't have a TV. He said, okay, when you go to Tallahassee, go to Best Buy, buy a TV for Wendy, and I'll pay you for it. And so Wendy got the TV, and she called Charlie. This is back in 2012. The murder's in 2014. And she thanked him for the TV, and he didn't say he looked into hiring a hitman. He joked, a bad joke, and he said it was cheaper than hiring a hitman.
Now, the one good thing for the defense is that it was 2 years before the hit occurred, but still a horrible joke that they have to admit he repeated over and over again. And then TV is the code word that was used. So it all kind of fits together a little too nicely. But there's at least an argument that if he really was going to do this, why did he wait 2 years? Now, I think the state could argue a lot of stuff was happening in the custody battle and it was just getting worse and worse and worse. They made the $1 million offer, which he says Wendy Adelson never even told Dan Markel about. But they have to admit he said it because so many people are going to admit that he made this joke about the TV being cheaper than a hitman.
Not only was it a bad joke, but you're going to hear in this trial, Charlie repeated the joke. He repeated it a lot to a lot of people. You're going to hear that he repeated it as late as March of 2014. So the man that they think hired a hitman is joking to others about hiring a hitman.
And if you can hear, there's sarcasm in the lawyer's voice. Now, I think we can assume Charlie Adelson's not completely brain dead since he is a successful dentist. So the defense is planning on saying it all fits together a little too well. And if you want my opinion, I don't necessarily love that angle for the defense because you're admitting the state's evidence all points to your guy and it looks really bad, but there's some other explanation. But that seems to be what they're doing. Like, of course the money came from Charlie Adelson. It was extortion. Of course he wouldn't actually make these jokes. He's not that dumb if he was actually going to do it. That's what they're saying here about the hitman jokes. Later he says, why would they ever create a paper trail of paying Catherine Magbanua through the dental office if it was really some secret that they were trying to hide? He would not be that stupid. That's basically what the defense is arguing. But the real bad guys knew about all this and used it against Charlie Adelson.
Pieces. And you're going to learn why his repeating of that joke is going to be so important. I'm going to tell you in a little bit. Keep in the back of your mind. But let's first go back to the divorce. The divorce was bitter. It was emotional. Wendy Adelson and Professor Markel, they'd have good times. But when things were bad, they would fight about everything. And in January 2013, Wendy Adelson filed a motion to relocate to South Florida with her 2 boys. That motion was opposed by Professor Markel. Now, what you're going to learn in this trial is that Wendy Adelson never thought that motion would be granted. Her lawyer told her that motion would never be granted. But she said, let's give it a shot. Charlie had very little to do with the motion. He knew she was filing it. He knew she didn't have much chance of getting it. And the motion was denied.
No surprise there, and Charlie wouldn't know anything about that. Then they get into how involved the Adelson family is with everything their kids do and how they came up with lots of crazy ideas of things to do, including the $1 million offer to Dan Markel, which Wendy never actually told Dan Markel, I guess. But he says none of the things they discuss are illegal. A lot of them are out there in the open. A lot of them are people know and heard about, and they even consulted lawyers to make sure what they were doing was legal. Like, is it legal to offer him $1 million? I actually know some cases where that does happen, where one side pays off the other to get more custody of the kids. It's really sad, but it happens. And it can be part of some kind of an agreement, a settlement agreement. We talk about how you can put a lot of things in a settlement agreement. But then we get into some of the details that they say the state doesn't know. That's going to be a shocking revelation to the state and to this jury. And that is that Sigfredo Garcia, one of the triggermen, Katie's father of her children, hated Charlie Adelson and tried to kill him and threatened to kill him. Charlie Adelson being the defendant, the person he's accused of conspiring with and trusting and paying this money to. Setting up, pointing the finger at Sigfredo Garcia and Katie Magbanua. And specifically talking about those threats and ways that he tried to, drive his car to where Charlie's car almost went off the side of a cliff one time. And the specific threats that he made and when he made those threats. That's very important. Now, how are they going to prove it? How are they going to corroborate all this? I don't know. But the timing is interesting about somebody you're about to make a huge decision with and trust literally with your life to commit this crime. Would it really happen if this stuff was going on in the background?
Call. not from our witnesses, from their own witnesses, of Professor Markel, the man who murdered him, hated Charlie Adelson, according to them, his co-conspirator. And you're going to hear, not from our witnesses, from their own witnesses, that he wanted to kill Charlie Adelson. You're going to hear that in March of 2004.
Again, like I said, it's probably not going to be too tough to make these triggermen seem biased and impeach their credibility and that they have it out for Charlie Adelson, whatever it may be. And this is one of the ways they're planning to do that.
14. Just 7 or 8 weeks before that first attempt of murder that they talk about. He tried to kill him. Puzzle pieces. You're also going to hear about a phone call on July 1, 2014. You're going to actually hear that that July 1, 2014 call is how they found these guys. It's actually the craziest fact in this entire case, and there's a lot of crazy facts. You're going to hear that on July 1, 2014, Sigfredo Garcia made a call to the cell phone number of Harvey Adelson. It's the only call.
Harvey Adelson is Charlie's dad, Wendy's dad, Dan Markel's father-in-law. So just a couple weeks before the hit is actually done, Sigfredo Garcia makes a call to the Adelson father and does this. Now, this is, and they can prove this. Now, what actually is said in these calls, I believe the only way they're going to be able to get it out is through testimony. I don't think there's any recordings of these calls, but we have the fact that the calls were actually made. My guess is the state's going to say they were discussing the hits and stuff like that. But listen to what the defense says happens just a couple weeks, again, before all these people, the Adelsons, Sigfredo Garcia, his friend Rivera, Kate Magbanua right in the middle, before all this was about to take place. And after they already tried to do it once in June and it didn't work, they had to go later in July. So right in the middle of all of that, this call was made. And this was the content of the call.
That helped investigators connect these folks to the Adelsons in the beginning. It actually broke the case. What they don't know, what you're going to see, it's in text messages. It's discussed on the wires. They don't know it because they don't understand it because they weren't there. Is that on July 1st, 2014, just 3 weeks or so after the first murder attempt. And by the way, just 17 days before the murder. Let me repeat that. The murder happens on July.
So let's just take a look at this timeline. Wendy files for divorce on September 10th, 2012. 14th, they try to do the motion to relocate. It's denied in June of 2013. Again, a full year before any of this happens. Divorce is final on July 31st. So it's basically done at that point. So you would think if it was going to be right after that, that's when it would have happened. Then in October, he starts dating Catherine Magbanua. The Yardbird dinner is in March. I believe this might be when they talked about the $1 million offer. And then June is the first attempt. July 1st is, again, the incident we're discussing, the road rage incident and the call. And July 18th is when the deed was actually done.
18, 2014. On July 1st, 2014, Sigfredo Garcia tries to run Charlie off the road. He threatens him. And what you're going to hear is that on July 1, he's so upset that he calls the Adelson Institute. He doesn't realize that Charlie isn't the doctor at the Adelson Institute. He just comes in and out of the place. So he gets their voicemail machine. And you know how dentists are? They say in an emergency, call a cell phone number, take your call at home on the cell phone number. What he hears in an emergency, call Dr. Adelson at such and such number. He thinks he's calling Charlie Adelson, but he calls Harvey Adelson. And he calls him and he threatens him. He tells him, if you keep dating Katie, we're going to go mano y mano. I'm going to kill you. 17 days before, according to them, he conspired with this man to kill Professor Markel.
So I wonder if Harvey Adelson is going to testify for the defense. How else would that conversation come in? Unless, I guess, Sigfredo Garcia is going to testify and admit to that. I don't know. The facts of this case and the witnesses they put out are going to be wild. Because I got to be honest, that is a puzzle piece that's going to cause a mess in the jigsaw puzzle. is in between these attempts and these conspiracies and $100,000 being paid from Charlie Adelson to the co-conspirators, plus a lot more to Catherine McManua. We're supposed to believe that they're working together, but also this guy is threatening and trying to kill Charlie Adelson. Why wouldn't he have just done it? And was that the motive of Sigfredo Garcia and Catherine McManua to set up and then extort Charlie Adelson? Some of that makes sense. It is wild. And there are issues that we'll talk about as we continue to hear the defense's theory. But that one is interesting if they can actually prove it through the phone records and the testimony.
Puzzle pieces.
But again, you're starting to create some burden of proof on your side, I feel like, and maybe they welcome it.
What you're going to learn is that in the spring of 2014, it became apparent to Katie that her dreams of financial security with Charlie were not going to work out. You will learn that Katie heard the hitman joke. You will learn that she heard the $1 million offer and she got some ideas in her head.
When did he say that was?
Going to work out. Apparent to Katie that her dreams of financial security is that in the spring of 2014, it became apparent to Katie
March-ish.
that her dreams of financial security with Charlie were not going to work out. You will learn that Katie heard the hitman joke. You will learn that she heard the $1 million offer and she got some ideas in her head. The state itself has called Catherine McManua the mastermind. And that's exactly what she was.
Because we know that they've tried her not once, but twice and ended up getting her convicted, and they called her the mastermind. Well, guess what? The defense is going to call her the mastermind as well. So much so that not just the mastermind to commit a crime against Dan Markel as a victim, but also the mastermind to commit a crime against Charlie Adelson as a victim. I probably would have added that line in here, but I thought it was a pretty good opening. It is wild. It's going to be tough to prove because it's just so wild. But I thought it was a pretty good story to be told. You guys tell me what you thought.
So now let's get to July 18th. I kept you waiting long enough.
So here's the day that 2 crimes were committed, not one. And the state doesn't even know about it.
The June attempt didn't happen because Rivera didn't want to kill Dan Markel when his boys were around. See, what you're going to learn is during that June attempt, on June 4th, 5th, Professor Markel had custody of the boys. You're going to learn that Professor Markel and Wendy Adelson shared custody 50-50. But you're going to learn that the state thinks Wendy Adelson was involved with her brother in a murder for hire, and she chose for the killers to kill her ex-husband when he had custody of her kids. Puzzle pieces. So you're going to learn that Luis Rivera, who is a bad guy, he had some conscience somewhere. He didn't want to do it in front of the kids. So they came back. By the way, on July 18th, who had custody of the kids when the murder actually happened? Professor Markel. You're going to hear he dropped them off at school. But this family who did this so that their grandchildren could be with them were going to risk for 2 hired hitmen to go up when he had custody of the kids. Puzzle pieces.
I mean, that to me is not, if they're willing to go this far and do it to try to get the kids, I don't think that that's so hard to believe. Like if they're willing to end the life of their grandchildren's father, whom they love, I don't think it would be that abnormal for them to do it while he had custody, knowing that he drops them off at school every day. I mean, that's just me. This was not one of the stronger points, in my opinion.
July 18th for Charlie starts as a normal day. He works. You're going to see.
So that's the crime committed against Dan Markel. Now let's listen to the crime committed against Charlie Adelson.
Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with South Florida, so I'm going to give you a little bit of geography lesson. He lives in Fort Lauderdale. That day, he's working in 2 offices because he'd often work in 2 offices a day. He'd work in the morning at one place and in the afternoon at another. So he's working in 2 offices. The first office he's working in, both of them actually, are in Jupiter, Florida. With South Florida traffic, with Palm Beach. When I drive up here,
He drives 2 hours.
You're 1/3 done. He's in the car and he's talking on the phone. And you're going to see it. We're going to show you what the phone calls are about. He talks to his sister, talks to his mom, talks to his girlfriend. We'll talk to you about it. There are phone calls. You're going to see it. There are a lot of phone calls.
And again, I think that's working in their favor that sure, you talk to your mom, your sister, girlfriend, but if the timing is always in the train scenario that the state laid out, it doesn't look good for the defendant.
And there are a lot of phone calls to his girlfriend. And there are a lot of phone calls to his mom. We're not going to deny that. And he works in these two offices. And at around 6 o'clock, you'll see a text message that he's about to start a very long surgery, a big procedure. By the way, the text messages throughout the day are normal. Just after 7 p.m., he gets a call from his mom. And he's told that Professor Markel has been shot. And he's shocked. He's upset. His first reaction is, Wendy and the boys okay? He's supposed to have dinner originally with a friend that night. But earlier in the day, that changes, and he's supposed to have dinner with Katie. And you're going to hear that Katie and him had gotten in a fight a couple days earlier about dinners. You'll hear it. And what you'll learn is after he finds out what happened, he tells Katie he doesn't want to go to dinner. He leaves the office at around 8 o'clock in Jupiter. And you'll learn that Katie tells him she'll come to his house that night.
So again, you're supposed to have dinner with Katie, cancels it. He finds out about what happened to Dan. He's sad, even though he didn't, necessarily like Dan. He's still sad. It's the father of his nephews. And then Katie ends up still coming to his house.
He shook up. Now, let me be clear. You're going to hear he wasn't close with Professor Markel. They weren't friends. They had nothing in common. But he shook up because someone he knew, the father of his nephews, had been shot. When Katie arrived that night, and you're going to learn more details of how she gets there, what she has to do to get there. It's not planned. You're going to see that. The state's going to put on that evidence. You're going to learn that she's scrambling to get a babysitter. You're going to learn, by the way, that Charlie had seen her for lunch the day before. So if it's a murder for hire, why didn't she get the money then? Puzzle pieces. You're going to learn that she gets there that night, sometime after 11. And when she gets there, she is frantic. She's upset. And he's scared because he's never seen her this way. And she sits him down and she tells him something terrible has happened. She says that a friend of hers had shot Professor Markel.
So this is the day he finds out it happened. Katie says a friend of hers did this.
She tells him over and over that she had nothing to do with it. But these people, she was talking too much. And her friend and these people learn about the problems his family was having with Professor Markel. They learned about the $1 million offer. And they got it in their minds to do this. As you can imagine, his life has just forever been altered. He asks, who are these people? She won't tell him. It's not.
So I'll just pause before we hear the rest of the story and what Charlie Adelson decides to do. What would you do if you heard that? I would be mortified, first off, obviously. Number one. Number two, I would call the police. That's what I would do. And I'd have Katie sit right there on the couch and say, you're not moving. Stay here and just tell me what you just told me about the police. Even if it's your friend and you said something about the $1 million offer, it's not your fault. They got it in their head to do this. Let's work with the police to get them. Yes, I realize I could be putting my life in danger. They could be coming after me next. But like if they come after me, they're never getting their money. So maybe I can set up a place where I can show up, tell them I have the $1 million. Police will be there too. And we just do. I mean, two guys show up in a Prius to do a job like this. It's not exactly, you're not working against, the Russian mob or something. I would call the police. And then at their trials, I would testify against them. And if I found out Katie Magbanua was involved, I would testify against her. I would be the state's star witness if I heard this the day it happened. He does none of that. Now, is it reasonable? Is it plausible? What's the jury going to think when they hear the steps Charlie Adelson decides to take and just continuing to pay them off and keep quiet and hide information about what happened? Now, if I'm the defense, I could say there was just all this evidence they were going to be able to use to connect him, and that's why he got scared, and that's why he paid everybody off, because he didn't want to get set up, and he felt like he was going to get set up. I guess that could be a plausible explanation.
Safe for you to know. Screaming at her. She won't tell him. Charlie had a guess. You will hear in detail what happened that night. You will learn that Charlie Adelson was told if he didn't pay within the next 48 hours, he or one of his family members would be next.
So, and there's another thing, we get indications. Sounds like Charlie Adelson's going to testify. How else would we get that information? Unless I guess we get it from Katie Magbanua. But to me, it seems like some of the things that he's saying about what's happening in phone calls. Where was Adelson going? What was he thinking? What was he doing? Why did he do what he did? What happened at a one-on-one meeting with somebody? It seems like the only way the jury would get that information is from Charlie Adelson himself. So I would lean toward him testifying at this point.
You will learn that Katie repeatedly said that she had nothing to do with it and acted distraught. You will hear how she said that she would help him. You will learn about the initial payment. It wasn't $100,000. It was more than $100,000. He took out everything he had in his safe. You're going to learn about that. The state doesn't know it. It was more money. But you're going to learn he didn't have $350,000. So he had to pay every month. They don't know about that either. Payments every month. Does that sound like a murder for hire? Or does that sound like extortion? You're going to hear about these gifts.
So,
and you're going to learn.
His argument is paying somebody for months and not just one lump sum at a time is more like extortion, not hiring a hit individually. But what I would say is once you get yourself into a situation like this, and again, I like to see this from both sides. So, and I think there are some arguments that make sense that may make it difficult for the state to prove. But when we talk about specifically multiple payments, to me, once you're in bed with somebody like this, it can turn into extortion. It wouldn't surprise me if after this occurred, then he was being extorted, number one. Or number two, once this happens, you got to pay him to stay on the same team. You're the money. That's the reason they did it. You got what you wanted, and now they're going to continue to get what they want. What I would think. But you guys let me know what you think.
That the gifts were just that. They were gifts. Because as time went on, he became more and more certain that Katie was not involved. He became more and more certain that she was helping him. And he wanted to keep her happy too because he needed her. He needed her help. And you will hear that the payments changed a couple months after the night of the extortion. 2 crimes. You'll hear that the payments changed and that Katie was put on the books of the Adelson Institute. Paper trail. They created a paper trail. Puzzles don't fit.
Exactly. That'd be too dumb to create a paper trail, right? It's like, unless he just didn't have enough money to keep paying her cash and it looked, easier and better. And maybe they thought that was like, they could see that money was going into her account. She was having this money, or maybe that was a way to try to hide it, acting like she worked there, thinking law enforcement wouldn't actually find out that she didn't in fact work there. I mean, those arguments could go either way. And what evidence are you going to have that proves your way? That's the tough part about saying we're both looking at this hand. And what's funny is this is kind of a good analogy because it's on camera. It's actually my right hand. But if you look on camera, it can actually kind of look like my left hand. So which side's going to be able to prove which hand it is? Right? I mean, and I can put on my other hand and say wedding ring, watch, I'm right-handed, so all this stuff's on my left hand. Or I could walk into a room from the camera and show you that it is in fact my right hand. So there's different ways to make those arguments and prove those things, but it's very risky to say, you guys look at the same piece of evidence and we're going to call it 2 different things. They're going to say it's red. I'm going to say it's blue. Because once they start deciding it's red, then you kind of lose credibility with some other arguments as well.
The puzzle don't fit. And you'll hear that in order to put her on the books, despite Katie telling him the night of July 18th, you can never talk about this with anyone. You can never talk on the phone about this. You can never talk about it in public. You can never talk about it anywhere. Because if they find out, they will kill you and your family. If they think the police are coming...
It's reasonable to think that those threats are legitimate since you know that they just executed a plan like this. But again, this is a movie script. Have you seen the movie Ransom? It kind of reminds me of the movie Ransom. But it's like most normal people, I would think, and it doesn't mean everybody, and doesn't mean that this is impossible. It is plausible and possible. But most people would still call the police and work with police. It's especially with this much money. Like hire private security if you have to. The fact that he instead decided to just keep paying them and paying them and paying them, all these different people involved, and telling them to keep quiet, almost as if he's protecting himself, train starts to go off the tracks a little bit.
You to talk to you, they will kill you. Look at what they did to Professor Markel. But you will hear that he told someone. He had to. He told his mom. You'll learn that she was the bookkeeper for the Dental Institute. You'll learn why he had to tell her. You'll learn about those checks. They've never been able to understand, why are they so sequential? Why are they back and forth? You'll learn why.
And I like those little points he's making. The state doesn't know a lot of this stuff. A lot of stuff doesn't make sense to the state. They'll even tell you, we don't know why I was like this or that, but we don't have to prove I was like this. So it's like, well, we know, and we're going to tell you why, and it makes sense with our theory. So that's why we got to keep an open mind and see how the evidence comes out in this case, because the defense is setting up a case that is going to look very different than even the state thinks it looks at this point.
They talk about the bump in 2016. What I like to call is the second extortion. What they don't realize is that their undercover operation was an extortion on an extortion. They don't know it. It's not their fault. And we're going to go through the wires with you. We're going
Basically saying that they're fake extorting them again as law enforcement. And the reason the Adelsons want to cover it up is because of the first extortion. Yes, they knew all what was happening, but it wasn't the way that law enforcement thought it happened. But they didn't know it, so it wasn't their fault for extorting the extortion.
Go through Dolce Vita with you. And we're going to show you how they actually prove his innocence. We're going to show you how they are talking carefully. They're talking to him. He's talking about an extortion. They're happy if this bump is the police, because if it's the police, none of them are going to get killed. If it's a bad guy,
they've literally been living in a mob movie. Now, the other part of this that makes it kind of interesting is, while all this continues to happen and the bump and stuff like that, I'm pretty sure Sigfredo Garcia, who is the man threatening them, is in prison. He was serving time for some unrelated event, and then he was arrested and convicted in this case. So how is this threat legitimate still? Why are they still not going to police? Like, once he went to prison, once he got convicted, first off, wouldn't you testify against him, number one? And number two, wouldn't you tell the police everything now that he's not a threat to hurt you anymore or your family? Or is there going to be some gang affiliation? And are we literally dealing with a mafiosa type of movie script here? I don't know all of this stuff. The state doesn't even know a lot of this stuff. I just know news reportings and what people have said. And so let's see what actually comes out in court as legitimate, reliable evidence.
They're in danger. If you do a murder with someone, the last person in the world you want this bump to be is the police. Because it means they're onto you. Puzzle pieces.
And that actually makes more sense than the state's argument that they're happy it's the police because if the police are looking, it means they don't have enough evidence. I think that's plausible as well, but I think this one is kind of more plausible. Is would they really be happy if it was the police? If they thought they got away with it 2 years, later? A lot of confusing, weird parts in this case. A lot of twists and turns, like a movie script. It is legitimately like a movie script.
Not from the first layer, she says, but from the second layer. I got goosebumps when she said it. It's one of my favorite lines in the recording. Not from the first layer, the first extortion, but from the second layer. 20 months later is the bump. That's the second layer to Charlie Adelson at that point in time.
So he's saying the recordings actually help them. And then he continues to go on, and you saw on the timeline, so much time passes between the actual crimes committed and Charlie Adelson getting arrested, or even the bump happening and things like that. And they had all the evidence before. They had all the wiretaps. They had all this stuff. It didn't really get that much clearer. They just have, continued to try to force puzzle pieces in a jigsaw, creating a mess. And that's why we are at trial here today. And then he basically says, they didn't arrest him back then. They shouldn't have. They shouldn't have arrested him now. And we get to the first couple witnesses. The first witness is the neighbor who explains what he saw. And the second witness and the third witness are law enforcement officers, crime scene investigators, just kind of explaining what they saw at the crime scene. But we'll finish up by just kind of saying or showing or listening to the 911 tape. Let me see. 320 would be 335. So 330, about 7.
Well, I don't know. Okay.
All right. Here's the 911 call. This is the neighbor that testified. I'll slow it down because sometimes 911 calls are hard to listen. They're hard to hear what they're saying. So, all right, let's take a listen.
911, see the rest of your emergency. It's right next door to my house, which is 2122 Trescott Drive. Can you repeat that for verification? 2122 Trescott Drive, the T. Okay, the phone number you're calling from? I'm calling from 850-212-4623. Okay, tell me exactly what happened. We heard a loud bang and the car pulled away from next door. I came over and looked in, the garage door was up, and I thought the gentleman was backing out, and I went back to my house, but he never backed out, and I came back over, and his driver's side window is shattered, and he's battered, he can't answer. He's inside. I don't know if somebody tried to shoot him, or if he shot himself, or what, I don't know.
And it was at this location, correct?
Right next door. I gave you mine. I don't know his address. It's next door.
Okay.
And so they continue to kind of talk about what the scene looks like, but that's the testimony that connected the Prius, which they connect later with cameras, and they connect to the shooters, and they connect the cell phones, connect to Kate McBanua, connect to Charlie Adelson and his family, and the web gets woven or weaved from there. And so they set up the background of what happened, and they'll continue to build as the state's case goes on with these evidence, with these witnesses and evidence that they're going to present. And we will follow it if you guys want us to. If this is a case that interests you, it is literally like a movie script. It's almost too wild to be a movie script. People probably wouldn't believe it. So let me know in the comments and by liking the video if this is one that you want us to follow and you want to continue to follow it with us. Let me know how you're watching it. Subscribe to our page and hit that reminder bell if you want to follow this trial as well, because we will continue to follow it and post recaps every couple days about what the witnesses are saying, how it's going from a lawyer's perspective, how the lawyers are doing, how they're proving their case, why they're asking certain questions. We can talk about rulings. We'll do a live so you guys can get your questions answered live about this trial if you are watching it. So just let me know that. As always, I appreciate you being here. Until next time, I'm out of here. Thanks for watching another episode of The Lawyer You Know. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the thumbs up and share with your friends who might be interested here on YouTube. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You can also follow us on all social media, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, at Lawyer You Know. But on Instagram, we are still at Tragos Law. So look us up on there. And don't forget to listen to the Lawyer You Know podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you have a case you want to talk to us about, if it's a personal injury case, wrongful death, catastrophic injury, car accident, or slip and fall case, please email us, lawyeryouknow@gmail.com. Of course, all of these links I just mentioned are included in the description below on this episode and every episode. So until next time, this is Peter Tragos, the Lawyer You Know.